After our meeting last Wednesday, I went to Home Depot with my camera to wander the aisles. I ended up in the plywood section because there were no people or employees to bother me. I was surprised at the variety of composite wood available: indoor, outdoor, finishing, base, different thicknesses and different sizes. Every piece was crafted for a different purpose. From plywood, I wandered over to decorative wood, which felt slightly overwhelming. So many different molding options, all claiming to be real wood. But any imperfection or chunk revealed that they were, in fact, just molds. I continued wandering into the metal and steel aisle, trying to make mental notes of how and when the metal and wood interacted within the walls of Home Depot. It was this thought that reminded me of a photo my dad shared with me this past week, a close-up version of something I'd seen last weekend when I toured the mill. This image is from my original tour. This group of logs was set aside because metal was detected within them. When I initially asked my dad about this, he told me it's usually nails or barbed wire. This log, however, seemed to have ingested the nail. Someone, at some point, had stuck it into that tree, and the tree continued growing around it. This idea stayed with me. Wood growing around metal, holding it in place. It seemed much different than the relationship we're used to seeing: metal cutting wood, or metal holding wood together. Friday morning, I took a look back at my notes from our conversation and recalled what you'd said about the lumber process. The wood itself went through a transformation, from very organic matter, broken down into very mechanical, methodical, regimented pieces. I wondered what the opposite of that process would look like. Could you return processed pieces to an organic form? I had the window frame still in my studio and decided to begin by documenting it entirely. I kept in mind the question of, when is a window no longer a window? During this process, I also remembered that I had a new, unused wooden picture frame from IKEA. It was the opposite of the wooden window. Lightweight, fabricated of many tightly knit pieces. I wondered how much metal held it together, as opposed to the window frame. I carefully documented each object, trying to pay special attention to the joints. My plan was to use the weekend to strip the wood, but first I consulted with my dad about the construction of the window and of the frame.
So it's short pieces of wood, and you take all the defect out, so there's no knots or anything, no blemishes, and then it's a certain size. Then you finger joint it back together, and it's pressed from each side, and there's glue in there, so it glues it back together to create one long piece of wood.
This surprised me. The notion that a collection of small, perfect pieces of wood was seen as more valuable or desirable than a solid piece of wood with slight imperfections.
Basically, when people are doing this, they're upgrading a piece of wood. So they're cutting it. Like if there's a defect right here, they're cutting that piece out. That's what creates these small pieces. And then they finger join it back together.
We then looked at the frames in comparison to each other.
This is like a pine.
That's a pine.
Yep.
It's so light compared to this.
Yeah, that's more of a hardwood there.
If I stripped that, would you be able to tell what kind of wood it is? More so.
Might be, yeah.
He later guessed Doug fir. I then began to look at disassembly for the IKEA frame. If I wanted to take this apart at the joints, is there a way that you can think of? No, you're just saying no.
No, that glue is probably the strongest part of that whole piece.
Really?
Yeah.
So even if you were to soak it in water,
you'll never pull it apart.
Really?
Nope.
Interesting. In my head, I felt that if I was going to compare old and new, I wanted to see the wood of the window frame. This may or may not have been the right next step. What I thought may be a day-long project stretched into 2 and then 3. The interior side of the window had 4 layers of paint: white, red, white, and green. Each one was a timestamp of a life and a home. Each layer took hours between application and scraping. During this process, I kept thinking of what I was removing. Underneath, the wood was still solid, still useful, but the paint still remained stained on the surface. Unsure of where this was going and what I was doing, I stopped this process. I checked in with Sarah Leah, sharing the work I'd done up until this point, and she encouraged me to keep going wide on this subject. This was her first time seeing the images I'd taken of the mill, and she too was taken aback by its largeness. We discussed how themes of both time and scale were recurring, as was the theme of accumulation over time. She encouraged me to go back to the images I'd shot of the mill, as well as to the possibility of visiting the forestry land so that I might see the process from start to finish. The land visit would have to wait until the weekend, but I decided to take her advice and look back at my existing images, as well as look at a collection of logging books I borrowed from my dad. Looking through the logging books was helpful. I was able to see familiar aspects of what I'd toured a week ago. I decided to scan some of the images that caught my attention. These images are from a now-defunct mill in a town called Westwood, which, oddly enough, I visited 2 years ago. Both these found images and the ones I took at the mill feel very unfamiliar to me in terms of material. How do I process whole objects? Unsure of how to proceed, I bring both into Photoshop, converting them to black and white, which I admit is my default, and begin to compose. Initially, I created a large canvas where I placed and replaced these images. Alignments began to emerge, and for the first time, I'm curious about this. And that's where I'm at for this week. Thank you.